Good morning, and thank you to the organizers for this wonderful conference and for the opportunity to participate in it. My name is Marc Anderson, and I work at the LORIA lab in Nancy, France. And the title of my talk is The Boundary Problem, Issues that a Comprehensive Ethical AI Will Have to Overcome. So, if I sum up this presentation, I would say that we're not very concerned about setting up fast, ultra-efficient systems which automatically and aggressively manipulate local environments. But we should be, I think, ethically speaking. To some people, AI is not that advanced. A colleague of mine here at LORIA says something like, well, AI is just nothing but a set of pattern matching algorithms. On the other hand, we have great hopes and dreams for AI. And so you get in definitions like that of the EU Commission high-level expert guidelines on AI, you get a suggestion that AI are reasoning systems with a focus on that. So based on current definitions and trends of AI interest, I think two areas of development will tend to converge. One is the urge towards strong AI, which comes out in suggesting that AI are reasoning systems. And the other is the urge toward AI-initiated ubiquitous collection of data. For example, you have web crawlers and scrapers working at the moment, and according to DeVito, you get a 40-fold time saving over human data collection. So it's hard to see that that is not the future of at least one part of AI. You also have the issue of data bias. This is already a prominent theme in AI ethics. And there's an uneasy tension there between what I call the data realm and the world. So on the one side, you have data, and you can easily ask, well, where is it? Well, it's in the cloud, or it's in the internet, but where it is not so clear. On the other side, you have the world. The world's very different. Our experience of the world is already, in many ways, pre-biased. And you have this increasingly overlapping area between them, which is manipulated or referenced by AI. And this can only get bigger, this overlapping area, I think. And because it is and does, I think this causes our discomfort and our ethical focus at the moment on data bias in AI ethics. The data view begins largely by assuming no boundaries, but human experience, of course, is filled with boundaries. What would seem a fairly harmless category, like car driver, to be working with, is so until you discover, according to Oskin and others, for example, that people in different cultures drive very, very differently. If I made an analogy, it would be something like, in the world, if you are wanting self-contained pure categories, well, that's like saying, I want to move somewhere with no neighbors, which if you think about it at the moment, it's not really possible. What kind of boundaries do we have then? We have human-made boundaries, obviously, and they're always really works in progress, such boundaries. Northern Ireland border, 78 years to resolve. Or on the ocean, South China Sea, partly human-made, partly natural, 73 years, an ongoing dispute. Or geographic, mountains ranges, for example, like the one between China and Nepal. Or religious and ideological boundaries, which are physical in some senses, but not quite physical as well. Wealth and social status boundaries, which do manifest themselves in actual physical boundaries sometimes, and so on and so forth. Some AI boundary scenarios then, one could imagine, would be single AI with hard boundaries or expansive fuzzy boundaries, multiple AIs with hard boundaries but set by developers, programmers, multiple AIs with loose boundaries under AI control, or multiple AIs with loose boundaries but under human control. These would be some of the possible scenarios. But each of them, I think, presents problems. In the case of single AI with fuzzy boundaries, the main point is that AI consequences the actions of AI, their consequences, cannot rest at boundaries, however you set those boundaries. Humans, with their boundaries, have some sense of a beyond. And they have time in human scale, and they take time, when we're wise, to feel the consequences relative to their boundaries. We have time to adapt on our human scale. But AIs, at least as we dream of them, have no sense of beyond very much. And by hypothesis, as we also dream of them, they're fast and they're efficient locally. So we set ourselves up for a state in which unknown consequences may drive feedback loops, where the AI will compensate in a local area by working even harder at its goal. It works at something, it produces unknown effects outside its boundaries, and then you get potentially disastrous rebounds. It's not hard to imagine that AIs are set to maximize some value within bounds set by a programmer. So for example, an AI could be set to maximize fresh water availability in some area, such as this. Well, this is just a map of East Africa, where the Nile is located. But of course, the Nile flows through 11 different countries. So the AI could be set to busily maximize water availability in here. But then what are the consequences? And there are sure to be consequences here and here and here and so forth. You could have the scenario of multiple AIs with hard boundaries. Here, you could have weak or strong AI restricted deliberately, but therefore indirectly ignoring consequences beyond their boundaries. So you might have something like a common interstitial space between, but with no common guidance, as for example the cells of the body have in having a common DNA which guides them to work together. But it wouldn't, of course, be an empty space. It's filled with nature and humans and so forth. It would be potentially a wild west, subject to the push and pull of the actions of various AI agents, and with corresponding unethical consequences through ignorance. You could have a scenario of loose boundaries under AI control, and here again, weak or strong AI free to grow. But each AI, presumably ignorant of the intentionality of AI action beyond their loose boundaries. This is why we hypothesize multiple AIs. Then in that case, ethical systems such as utilitarianism would have the homogeneity of intentionality, which they assume negated. By hypothesis, AIs will not have such things as a happiness or pleasure, as a common intention for them. And then you would get, where the areas of growth overlap, a sort of competition by ignorance between AIs. You could also have loose boundaries under human control. We retain the control to a lesser or greater degree, and these could be strong or weak, again, with their boundaries set or loosened deliberately by developers. And you can imagine they could be local, they could be corporate, they could be national, such as in germ stage, I would say, with the Chinese social credit system. Or you could have other actors, bad actors, the equivalent of AI equivalent of people who create viruses. You can imagine cases where you have a developed nation with AI guidance, with resources and infrastructure to implement that guidance, and maybe right next door or not far away, less developed nations, where you have AI guidance perhaps, but with few resources and infrastructure. And that could quickly lead to winner-takes-all scenarios. And you can also add in the concept of loss aversion. Scherzinger has shown that there is loss aversion effect between robots and humans in competition. And this would be on a greater scale, where the less developed and less resource-rich side would easily say, it's hopeless, we can't compete. So what would a comprehensive ethics look like? What are the minimums for an ethical solution to AI and boundaries? Well, my suggestion is that the ethics will have to be logically consistent in its assumptions. It'll have to be dynamic, which means focused on actions and processes rather than objects, because actions and processes will more easily interpret across boundaries. So for example, you would speak of growing versus body weight in a situation of the ethics of malnourishment or nourishment, for example, in some bounded area. It would be organic as well, so that ethical responses to the whole are already embedded in actions directed at the part. So in this case, the AI's ethical structure will grow along with it, will be built in from the beginning and will grow with it as it grows. Not easy things to implement perhaps, but I think we will need to institute at least these points for a comprehensive ethics for this problem. Thank you very much.